There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Schaff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
This is What in the World is Going On. I'm your host, Richard Schaff. The program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, and here only by the grace of God. The Democrat Party is at war with America. That's a clear message of the Democrat response to the crisis that have engulfed our nation over the last 6 months. Made our streets war zones, destroyed the small business communities, these that are the lifeblood of our system. When the country was attacked by a deadly virus from China in January, the Democrats attacked the president's efforts to stop it at the border, then blamed him for the over 110,000 deaths that followed. Yet Democrat governors controlled the health systems of every major center of the COVID-19 devastation. And they were totally responsible for any policies of theirs that failed. When the president attempted to reopen the country in May, Democrat governors and mayors issued Iraqian orders to arrest individuals, violating their social distancing injunctions by strolling in parks or lounging on beaches, and worst of all, attempting to open up their barbershops and hair salons. As a direct consequence of these imposed shutdowns, 40 million Americans lost their job. To many of us, the Democrat purpose was clear: depress the economy and blame the consequences on the president. This became the incessant theme of their political utterances and ads. Yet these seditious Democrat attacks on the commander-in-chief in the midst of the war against an invisible enemy maintained a cover of plausibility because of the uncertainties surrounding the virus and how it was spread. The mask was dropped when a civil insurrection erupted in the wake of the horrific police murder of George Floyd. In its wake, America's streets were filled with massive crowds of protesters, and as it turned out, domestic terrorists. These terrorists, led by the communist organization Antifa, used the protests as a cover for violent and hateful attacks on ordinary citizens and their businesses. As these attacks escalated into the torching of city centers and the destruction of poor communities, the hypocrisies of Democrats and their true agendas became inescapably clear. Virtually all of the mayhem was centered in Democrat-controlled states and cities. The same mayors who had jailed local business people and ordinary citizens for congesting in groups of more than 10 were utterly silent as crowds of thousands formed to tear their cities apart. Meanwhile, not a single word was uttered, not a single arrest made by these same Democrat governors and mayors to prevent the protesters and rioters from violating the social distancing ordinances they had used to close churches and houses of worship the week before. While stores, apartment buildings, and even police stations were torched by violent radicals, while ordinary citizens were being terrorized, Democrat governors were reluctant to call out their National Guard and nip those riots in the bud. This reluctance became active resistance when they defied the president's appeals to take them to every measure necessary to stop the terrorists in their tracks and restore law and order to our cities. One of the most frightening sights amidst all of the mayhem was the direct threat the street terrorists posed to the White House. Thousands of rioters and protesters gathered in front of the White House. Many of us saw it on TV, didn't we? What were the protesters doing at the White House in the first place? The president had condemned the murder of George Floyd and called his family immediately after the event. There wasn't a politician or public figure in the entire nation who were defending the killer cops. Why were these crowds menacing the White House and attacking the Secret Service, 50 of whose members had already been injured by their violent assaults? Every night for the preceding week, the peaceful protest had turned into violent attacks on law enforcement and the surrounding area. And night after night, the Democrat mayor of Washington failed to provide the security necessary to make the street in front of the White House a safe place for the members of our government, including our president. On Sunday, May 31st, the mob in front of the White House set fire to the 200-year-old St. John's Church. Fed up with the support that Democrat governors and mayors were giving to the insurrection and the violence, the president decided on a bold step. On Monday, June 1st, he amassed overwhelming numbers of the National Guard and demanded an early curfew, planning to clear the streets and to demonstrate to the seditious governors and mayors what they needed to do. The National Guard drove the angry mob, the protesters and terrorists. They drove them away from the White House, and then the president and key members of his cabinet walked over to the church. We saw it, many of us, didn't we? Every American who cares for their country and its president, those of us who were watching this walk held our breaths, uncertain as to whether the president and his cabinet would be attacked and possibly assassinated, as so many public figures on the left were already advocating. Yet no sooner had the walk been completed than CNN and the Democrat media were mocking the president and creating the Democrats' new fake news talking point. Trump had ordered the National Guard to use tear gas to attack a group of peaceful protesters in order to feed his narcissism for a photo op, as if Donald Trump needed a photo op, and as if the peaceful protesters across the country had not systematically provided cover for the black-clad Antifa terrorists wreaking havoc across our country. And is the need to purposely use tear gas did not expose the menace posed by the crowd that was ready to violate a curfew in front of the White House, the crowd that was ready to resist the representatives of law enforcement who had asked them 3 times to leave? Oh, yes. And a couple of side notes, folks. The National Guard had been called into the Washington area originally to control the pandemic. You know, got to be careful. Can't get more than 6 feet away. Can't have more than 10 people in the building. They'd been called in, and they were put in a hotel. And when this happened, what did the mayor of New York or Washington do? She canceled the accommodations for our National Guard while they were out on the streets defending her city. Wow. What does that boil down to? Meanwhile, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and the Democrat mayor of Washington, Elizabeth Warren, they all condemned the president's actions, summing up the party line. Here it is, folks. I'll give it to you. Quote, the president of the United States tear gassed peaceful protesters in order to clear the way for a useless photo op outside the White House, just after vowing to activate the military against our own people. Lives and our democracy are in danger. End quote. Yes, good listeners, lives and our democracy are definitely in danger. But the danger comes from a Democrat Party that's at war with their country and willing to aid and abet a terrorist force, Antifa, whose clearly stated purpose is the destruction of our country. And the Democrats are continuing to use Antifa to foment revolution, to set the reality in which Antifa plans to prosecute the Democrats' promised revolution. It needs to attack all the pillars of society. Throughout the country, they burned post offices, police precincts, banks, gas stations, city halls, and courts. They even hit the CNN Center, and now they're hitting churches. Barack Obama started the, quote, fundamental transformation of the United States of America, end quote from him. Yet, this is not Obama's Antifa. A failure as president, yes. He did manage to accomplish one important prerequisite for this rebellion, however. He instilled in the left the understanding that change must be forced upon an unwilling electorate. With this insight, Antifa has transitioned from pajama boy blobs of perpetually offended individuals, most likely drawn from those who were picked last in high school. They've transformed them into a trained guerrilla force with cool uniforms. Oh yeah, fascists like cool uniforms. Antifa, the paramilitary arm of the Democrat Party, spent the last 3 years recruiting and organizing. They've mobilized and learned tactics. They have a plan, and they're working hard to cover all the bases. Starting slow, they probed to find what the government would allow, media would trumpet, and the public would endure. When they burned the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, they knew they could get away with anything. And, as we've seen, they can adapt. This was evident last Monday night in New York City, Instead of massing together in one place to confront the police, they executed lightning attacks in small groups. Hitting commercial properties, they ripped down plywood and broke windows. They didn't loot or dilly-dally. They moved quickly to the next target before the police could respond. This hit-and-run tactic is perfect for their organization because spreading the destruction over larger areas negates the numerical advantage of police and National Guard. They will surely take this nationwide. It's what guerrillas do. But why now? Well, with efforts by those that were formerly in the Obama administration and their media minions to dispose President Trump, they've collapsed, and the thinly confected impeachment attempt went down in flames. Democrats knew they needed to rethink and regroup. They had to do something different. The advent of COVID and the ensuing lockdowns gave them the perfect opportunity to kill the crown jewel of Trump's presidency. What was that? The booming economy, of course. Democrat governors would prolong the lockdowns through election November 3rd, 2020. Yet, with Republican-run states successfully ditching the lockdown to no apparent penalty, their plan was crumbling. And just last Friday, we saw the jobs report. It was the best report in the history of our federal jobs reports. Goes back decades. What were we expecting? Jobs to be down some 7 or 8 million. What happened? They were up 2.5 million. What's happened? Now, time for Plan B. The Democrats needed an excuse, and the murder of George Floyd was perfect. It was time for them to unleash Antifa. Antifa started with Democrat-run cities, of course, where the political leadership provided them a shield of protection against identification and arrest. Minneapolis was a test case, then Atlanta, New York City, Seattle, Portland, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, among others, became flashpoints of unrest. The media and the Democrats portrayed the riots as a groundswell of support for not only those protesting Floyd's murder, but also for their vision of hope and change. They bemoaned the violence, destruction, and anarchy, but reminded Americans that this was what democracy looked like under President Trump, and the people have spoken. They even mentioned on one broadcast that I saw, in the middle of showing some scenes of violence erupting, I think it was in Minneapolis, this is Trump's America. How one-sided, how demonic. Even as the rioting became more violent and destruction more prevalent, media figures stood in front of cameras insisting the protests were mostly peaceful, while buildings burned and riots raged behind them. Democrats and talking heads pulled from their bag of tricks the time-honored fascist big lie. It was the right-wing extremists who were causing all the violence and damage. Did you see any, folks? You can bet if there'd been one, they'd have put a camera on them. I didn't see any. People, however, know the riots have been every night for days have been fomented by Antifa in a deliberate plan to instigate a revolution. They do this with the full support of the Democrats in control of the cities and states where their arson, looting, and terror have been most effective. Rioting, looting, violence, arson can only be effected when Democrat governors and mayors force their police to stand down under the ruse of allowing protesters to, quote, blow off steam. Had the police enforced zero tolerance, Antifa, lacking in numbers, would have folded. But when police are not free to police, it's as if there are no police. It only takes one uniformed white boy, black-clad Antifa with his backpack, communications equipment, and expensive gas mask to break a window out of a Target's or a CVS. The consequent looting then appears organic. It only takes one Antifa trained in crowd agitation techniques to incite a riot. Some believe, quote, it's fun to break things. It's fun to run wild and attack cars and bludgeoning the innocent. Targeted arson doesn't take a team. In an atmosphere of chaos, it takes one man with the right equipment, training, and a list of high-value targets. Democrats have a plan. Antifa is working the plan. After all, Antifa did not train themselves, and the choices of what to burn was not happenstance. What is it, folks? It's an attempt by the Democrats and Antifa to overthrow the status quo and force a new world upon Americans. This is a revolution the Democrats couldn't win legitimately at the ballot box, or they couldn't steal it in the 2016 presidential election, or they couldn't force it upon America through the coup that they've been prosecuting these last 3.5 years. You see, folks, it's becoming more evident each day. Trump is our last best hope. Almost alone, but with burgeoning support. Trump sees what's happening. His law and order speech on Monday night was perfect. Law and order always sells because people want to protect their families and property and live in a world where they don't have to fear rioters or government. Trump walking across grass where people rioted the evening before to St. John's Episcopal Church, a target of Antifa arsonists, was a signal to America that we will prevail because he is with us. Earlier in the day on a conference call, he had told the nation's governors they were, quote, weak, that they must take back the streets. Now we're watching outright rebellion and revolution. And folks, we must not let them win. Trump promised that he would stop this with the National Guard and with the rest of our armed forces if that's what it takes. With the Democrats and media supporting Antifa, Trump, folks, is really our last hope. And by the way, Antifa, they were plotting their insurgency. They've been plotting it for months. Their plot for an anti-government insurgency has been in the works since the start of the presidential election cycle began last November. The justice for George Floyd's demonstration were the catalyst for unleashing its plans in an election year. Antifa's actions represent a hard break with the long tradition of a peaceful political process in the United States. That's a quote from National Security Council staff member Rich Higgins, told to the Washington Times last week. Continuing his quote, their Marxist ideology seeks not only to influence elections in the short term, but to destroy the use of elections as the determining factor in political legitimacy. End quote. A program of widespread civil unrest is a hallmark of domestic terror groups, regardless of the circumstances that give it a vehicle, and the piggybacking of local gangs to put its goals into action is the way it's done. President Donald Trump's election and revitalization of America are a threat to Antifa's goals. A quote from Defense Intelligence official and counterinsurgency expert Joe Myers. Continuing, they are fomenting this violence to create havoc, despair, and to target the Trump campaign for defeat in 2020. Antifa has loosely been described as a, quote, anti-fascist movement, but its demonstrations in its black-clad outfits and masks are generally designed to sow division, discord, and chaos in American politics. President Trump has pointed to their movement in the most violent, disruptive, and destructive riots often happening beyond the hours of local curfews. It happens, of course, in the dark of night. In recent days, our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists, violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. That's a quote from Trump in his anti-riot speech last Monday in the White House Rose Garden. This with police flashbangs going off in the background. The President and the Attorney General want to know what FBI Director Christopher Wray did, what the FBI was doing to track and dismantle and survey and prosecute the Antifa. This is a question and a quote from White House National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. And he continued, if that hasn't been happening, we want to know what the plan is going forward, end quote. The official U.S. designation of Antifa as a domestic terror organization gives more latitude for surveillance and investigation. And this now, just briefly from Sean Hannity, came to my desk the other day. The Attorney General says the Department of Justice has evidence that Antifa is hijacking the George Floyd protests. Attorney General Barr told reporters last Thursday the Department of Justice now has evidence the Antifa movement is attempting to hijack the George Floyd protest to promote their far-left radical agenda. Attorney General Barr announced Thursday that investigations of recent violence spinning out of protests yielded evidence that not only are various political organizations taking advantage of the unrest for their own ends, but that foreign actors and others are also getting involved. It was carried publicly, folks, on Fox News. Yes, President Trump went to church. And you know, folks, now the rest of us need to follow. This isn't exactly accurate. There was no chorus of worship, no corporate prayer, no holy reverence, no gathering of believers, and thus actually no literal church. Just the leader of the free world in the charred, boarded-up shell of a building marred with fire at the hands of mutinous rogues. Amid nationwide protests and riots over the needless death of George Floyd at the hands of dishonorable police officers, the president stood outside the vandalized historic structure. St. John's Episcopal Church isn't the only desolate house of worship today. Church buildings across America stand empty, as ineffectual as if they too were consumed by the fire, shuttered not by anarchists, but by tyrants. Christians have for months been separated from one another thanks to state lockdown orders. We know about that, don't we, folks? The overwhelming majority of congregations have honored the virus regulations imposed by authorities, who would sooner dispense with communion than lottery tickets. To love their neighbors, protect the vulnerable, and remain above reproach, Christians stayed home, resorting to virtual meetings, sermon archives, and other poor substitutes for worship. In the process, we sacrificed our spiritual vitality. As anti-religious leaders and malicious media predictably shammed our communities of faith, believers rolled over our good intentions of meek compliance, manifesting in cowardice. When the media employed scare tactics, telling us that gathering together will kill grandma, well, Christians fearfully relented. When detractors peddled bogus rhetoric masquerading as science, shopping is fine, but singing, boy, that's way too dangerous. Believers capitulated. We're told groups of more than 10 people were simply not doable. Outdoor services were deemed unsafe. Even parking too close in a parking lot of having too many people in one car during drive-in services was prohibited. Police surveyed churchgoers, recording their license plate numbers. Those that attended the services is the only way we can ensure that your decision doesn't kill someone else. You've heard the message. The message, though, from media and oppressive leaders has been clear. Church gatherings are deadly. But now, folks, the game has changed. As brutal anarchists take to the streets alongside masses of peaceful protesters, all of the media's cards are on the table. Progressive governors have shown their hands. The coronavirus scare tactics have largely ceased. Believing fast food is essential while the Lord's Supper is not essential? It's always been ridiculous, hasn't it? But believing worship is lethal while looting is warranted is downright infuriating. Are large gatherings dangerous or aren't they? In running interference for riots and condemning the president's call for dominating the violent mobs, the media and leftist governors have answered that question for us. If the mitigating factor for large groups of people is no longer public safety but righteous anger, then Christians undoubtedly qualify. Of course, states have kicked off their reopening plans, including, at the behest of the president, allowing churches to reopen with large arbitrary regulations. But these rules are stifling. We cancel our song services. We worship in shifts. We fracture our bonds of congregating in coteries at 6-foot intervals. Religious leaders have bent over backwards to ensure public safety and care for their congregations, taking full precautions. But to what end? When will we say enough is enough? Scripture commands submission to government authority, but at some point believers must obey God rather than men. When have Christians ever regarded physical health above spiritual health? When has enduring persecution ever enthralled abandoning firmly held beliefs? How can Christians expect spiritual revival, racial harmony, and peace while neglecting our assembling to God and together? It's time for believers to sing from the tops of their lungs in one full accord, not sit silently in countless rotational services that undermine the unified body of Christ. It's time to gather around the table, contemplating with holy reverence Christ's broken body and his blood shed for us. It's time to confess our sacred doctrine and call upon our great Redeemer in corporate praise. No longer can we afford to live in fear. Christians must gather again. Church must recommence. And that needs to happen now. And Trump with his Bible fighting for the soul of America. Let me quote 1 Corinthians 3:19. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their own craftiness. Again, 1 Corinthians 3:9. The reaction by the left over President Trump standing in front of St. John's Episcopal Church with a Bible in his hand has been over the top, but very instructive. The left's manifestation of outrage lay bare their greatest weakness. What is that? Their hatred of faith. Rush Limbaugh said in a recent radio broadcast, I think he put it perfectly, and I'm going to quote him, but eventually the camera zeroed in, focused in on Trump in front of the church holding up a Bible. And I knew when he held up the Bible, it's like showing Dracula the cross. If the drive-by media is Dracula, a bunch of bloodsuckers showing the Bible. You talk about it triggering somebody, and it did. They were livid. The left, encompassing the Democrat Party and the media, went crazy because the image of Trump walking to that church across from the White House, a sanctuary of history, and then standing in front of that church with a Bible in his hand, conveyed a powerful image of hope. This hope came after Trump issued a brief and powerful speech minutes before, promising to restore law and order to this beleaguered nation. I watched that speech and felt a sense of calm because of his leadership. I then felt inspired after this man walked, without a mask of fear, to the front of that church, damaged by rioters, and boldly he held up a Bible. And there lies the answer to overcoming the left, humbling ourselves, and turning to God. The battle we face for the soul of America is more than just one intellectual pursuit. It's spiritual, good listeners. It's spiritual at its very core. Goodbye until next week.